You have probably heard stories of generals who stood up to Hitler, men who dared to question him even when it cost them their careers, their freedom, or their lives. But this is not that story. This is the story of the man who never resisted, the one who signed everything put in front of him, the one who never once said no. His name was Wilhelm Keitel, and he became one of the most infamous symbols of blind obedience in modern history. His life reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person is not the leader who gives the order, but the loyal follower who carries it out without hesitation. Wilhelm Keitel's journey began quietly, far from power and politics. He was born in 1882 in the small village of Helmscherode in Germany's Harz Mountains. His family lived on a modest agricultural estate, often struggling to make ends meet. His father, Karl Keitel, never admired Prussian dominance and often considered the military an institution of oppression. When Wilhelm lost his mother at only 6 years old, his childhood lost much of its stability. Without her guidance, his early years were marked by uncertainty and a lack of clear direction. And yet, when he turned 19 in 1901, Wilhelm made a choice that defied his family's beliefs. He joined the Prussian army. For the first time, he chose ambition over values. The army gave him purpose, structure, and authority, things his family's small estate could never provide. This moment set the tone for the rest of his life. Whenever faced with a choice, Wilhelm would take the path of obedience to authority, even when it meant betraying other principles. During World War I, Keitel proved himself competent, though never extraordinary. He served as an artillery officer and staff officer on the Western Front. In 1914, he was wounded by shrapnel, but returned to duty after recovering. His superiors praised him for discipline, order, and steady organizational skills. But they also noted his lack of creativity or strategic brilliance. He was the officer who could keep things running smoothly, but not the one who would come up with bold or innovative plans. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of its ability to maintain a general staff. Yet Keitel found new purpose in the Truppenamt, a disguised version of the band staff. In this role, he quietly helped build the framework for future German rearmament. It required secrecy, precision, and a willingness to bend or break the law. For Keitel, these were not obstacles, they were simply orders. This willingness to cross legal boundaries at the command of superiors revealed his true nature, a man who believed obedience mattered more than ethics. In 1933, the Nazi Party came to power. Like many officers of the old army, Keitel kept his distance. He viewed the party's violent rhetoric with suspicion. Discipline, rank, and structure were the world he trusted, not radical political movements. But that perception shifted the moment he met Adolf Hitler face to face. Witnesses described a remarkable transformation. It was as though Keitel had found the ultimate authority he had been searching for all along. Whatever doubts he had carried dissolved. From then on, his loyalty to Hitler became unwavering. By 1935, Keitel's loyalty had been rewarded. He was appointed chief of the Wehrmacht office, a position that made him a vital link between the military and Hitler's government. He was promoted to major general and gained the trust of the regime. Hitler quickly realized Keitel's greatest quality was not military genius, it was complete obedience. For Hitler, who distrusted independent thinkers, this made Keitel invaluable. The turning point in Keitel's career came in 1938 during the Blomberg-Fritsch affair. Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg and Army Commander Werner von Fritsch were seasoned officers who represented the old guard. They had misgivings about Hitler's rapid expansion plans and remained committed to some independence from Nazi control. Hitler wanted them gone, but he needed someone inside the military to help carry out the purge. Keitel stepped forward. When Blomberg married Erna Grun, Keitel unearthed her criminal record and passed it on to Hermann Göring. This information forced Blomberg to resign. Soon after, accusations of homosexuality were leveled against Fritsch based on questionable testimony. Keitel assisted in building the case that led to his downfall. Within weeks, both men were gone, and Hitler had cleared the last major obstacles within the army's leadership. Many officers watched with disgust. They saw Keitel's actions as betrayal, sacrificing comrades for personal gain. Even within the Nazi hierarchy, his reputation suffered. Fellow officers mocked him, calling him Keitel, a cruel pun meaning lackey. Field Marshal von Kleist sneered that Keitel was a stupid follower of Hitler. Göring once dismissed him as a sergeant as mind inside a field marshal as body. But none of that mattered to Hitler. What others saw as weakness, Hitler saw as absolute strength. Keitel's willingness to obey without question made him the perfect tool. When the War Ministry was abolished, Hitler took direct control of the armed forces. He needed a chief of staff who would carry out his will without hesitation or conscience. Keitel, who had proven his loyalty during the purge, was the obvious choice. His appointment as chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, shocked many in the army. He was not the most skilled, not the most innovative, and certainly not the most respected, but he was the most obedient, and that was all Hitler wanted. From this point on, Keitel's role shifted. He was no longer just an officer. He became a bureaucrat of war. He was not on the front lines leading soldiers. Instead, he sat behind a desk, translating Hitler's words into official orders. Those signatures would soon unleash devastating consequences. Where other commanders hesitated, delayed, or even tried to quietly soften harsh directives, Keitel did the opposite. He enforced them. If the wording seemed uncertain, he clarified it. If the command appeared too vague, he sharpened it. His pen became as deadly as any weapon. This transformation was complete by 1939, as Europe stood on the brink of war. Keitel had fully surrendered his independence. He was no longer the cautious, uncertain young officer who joined the army against his father's wishes. He was now Hitler's yes man, the one who would sacrifice comrades, traditions, and even the rules of war itself just to remain loyal. As the storm of World War II prepared to break, Keitel stood at the center of the machine that would carry out Hitler's ambitions. He had chosen obedience over morality so many times that it had become second nature, and as the orders became darker, his signatures became the tools that transformed words into actions. By 1939, Europe was on the edge of war, and Wilhelm Keitel stood at the center of Germany's military machine. He had risen not through brilliance or courage, but through obedience. Now, as chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, he became the bureaucrat who would turn Hitler's ambitions into reality. Every order passed through his desk, and with each signature, he pulled the German army deeper into policies that defied both law and morality. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of Keitel's most infamous years. His job was not to lead armies on the battlefield, but to ensure Hitler's directives were transmitted without resistance. As German troops advanced, Keitel's name appeared on orders that blurred the line between military operations and ideological war. For him, it did not matter whether the command violated international law. His role was to obey, and obey he did. The true test of his obedience came in 1941, as Hitler prepared to launch Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In May of that year, Keitel signed the guidelines for the conduct of the troops in Russia. These instructions went far beyond traditional warfare. They labeled entire groups of civilians as hostile, called for ruthless measures against partisans, and stripped away protections normally afforded under the rules of war. Where some officers balked, Keitel signed without hesitation. His pen ensured that brutality became official policy. A few weeks later came perhaps his most infamous act, the Commissar Order. On June 6, 1941, Keitel approved Hitler's directive that Soviet political officers captured in battle were to be executed immediately. These commissars were to be denied all legal protection as prisoners of war. Thousands were shot as a direct result. International law was clear. Prisoners of war had rights. But Keitel dismissed such concerns, sharpening the order's language to make sure there was no room for mercy, and yet he was not finished. In December 1941, Keitel signed the Night and Fog Decree. This order authorized the secret arrest and disappearance of political opponents in occupied Europe. Resistance members and dissidents were taken away under the cover of darkness, their families left with no answers. They were transported to secret prisons, vanished into what the Germans called Nacht und Nebel, night and fog. The decree created an atmosphere of fear that silenced entire communities, and again, it bore Keitel's signature. These were not isolated cases. Throughout the war, whenever Hitler issued a brutal directive, Keitel ensured it was carried out. Other generals sometimes resisted. Some softened orders or quietly ignored them. A few resigned rather than participate. But Keitel never resisted. He sharpened, reinforced, and delivered orders that transformed Hitler's ideology into systematic policy. His obedience continued even when Hitler himself began to lose control. After the failed July 20th, 1944, assassination attempt on Hitler, Keitel joined the so-called Court of Honor. This secret tribunal expelled more than 7,000 officers from the army and handed them over to the People's Court, where most faced death sentences. Over 5,000 were executed. These were men who had chosen conscience over obedience, but Keitel showed no mercy. For him, loyalty to Hitler remained more important than loyalty to comrades or humanity. By the time Germany collapsed in 1945, Keitel had become one of the most recognizable symbols of obedience. On May 8, 1945, he signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Berlin-Karlshorst. The scene was symbolic. His hand trembled as he signed the document, but he could not escape the reality that his signature had once unleashed orders that reshaped the fate of millions. Now, with one final act of signing, he closed the chapter on the regime he had served so faithfully. But the story did not end there. Captured by the Allies, Keitel faced trial at Nuremberg. It was here that the world saw the full extent of his blind loyalty. He arrived at the International Military Tribunal, convinced that his obedience would protect him. He argued that he was merely a soldier following orders, bound by the principle of loyalty to his superior. In his mind, he was guilty of nothing more than discipline. The prosecutors, however, presented overwhelming evidence. They laid out order after order bearing Keitel's name: the Commissar Order, the Night and Fog Decree, the ruthless directives against civilians in the Soviet Union. Witnesses testified that Keitel had opportunities to resign or to step aside, but he never did. Other officers had chosen to resist. He had not. Keitel's defense rested on the principle of superior orders. He claimed he had no choice but to obey Hitler, that disobedience would have meant his own death. But the tribunal rejected this argument. They declared that following illegal orders could not shield a man from responsibility. Obedience did not absolve guilt. The court ruled that superior orders might explain a soldier's actions, but they could not justify crimes against humanity. On October 1, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel was found guilty on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He asked for a soldier's death by firing squad, hoping to maintain some shred of dignity. His request was denied. The judges ruled that his crimes were not those of a soldier, but of a criminal. He would be hanged. On October 16, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel walked to the gallows. His final words were a plea for God to have mercy on the German people. He reminded the world that millions of German soldiers had died for their country, and now he followed them. But history had already delivered its verdict. His life had become a lesson, not in courage, but in the dangers of blind obedience. Wilhelm Keitel's story remains one of the most haunting in military history. He was not remembered for brilliance, for courage, or for leadership. He was remembered as the man who said yes to everything, the general who traded morality for loyalty, the bureaucrat who signed away his soul. His life serves as a warning that the greatest evil does not always come from those who shout the loudest. Sometimes it comes from those who remain silent, those who obey without question, those who forget that conscience must always come before command.